Madeline James was used to being invisible, just another tired face behind a diner counter, forgotten the moment a customer walked out the door. But one rainy night, a man in a $1,000 coat sat in her section, looked her straight in the eye, and made an offer so strange, so unbelievable, she almost laughed in his face. A week pretending to be his girlfriend. $10,000. No strings. No intimacy. Just one role. She should have said no. She didn't. And that was the moment everything changed. Madeline James didn't believe in luck. Not after everything she'd been through. Her 20s had been marked by survival, not success, paycheck to paycheck, rent always late, exhaustion always lingering. At 26, she was working night shifts at a dingy diner on the edge of downtown, serving coffee to people who barely looked at her and fending off the occasional drunk customer with a forced smile and tired eyes. Her clothes were clean but faded, her hair usually tied back in a messy bun, and her shoes had long since lost their support. She wasn't anyone you'd look at twice. That night, the rain had been pouring since sundown. The city was slick and shining, streetlights blurred through foggy glass. Inside the diner, it was warm but far from cozy, old fluorescent lights, sticky menus, and the scent of burnt grease that never really left. Madeline was cleaning a booth when she heard the bell above the door chime. She didn't even look up at first. Customers came in all the time just to get out of the rain. But this man was different. She glanced over and stopped. The man who entered looked like he'd walked out of a magazine ad. His coat was dry despite the storm outside, tailored perfectly to his tall frame. His dark hair was neatly styled, his jaw sharp, his expression unreadable. And his eyes, cold, gray-green, and focused, swept across the room before landing on her. She held his gaze for just a second longer than she meant to before quickly turning away, grabbing a menu and heading toward his booth. He sat down like he owned the place, like he owned every place, and watched her as she approached. She didn't like the way her hands felt suddenly clumsy. "Coffee?" she asked, setting down the menu. "Black," he said simply. She nodded, turned to walk away, but before she could, his voice stopped her. "I have a question," he said. "And a proposal." She frowned slightly, glanced over her shoulder. "I'm not that kind of waitress." He gave the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not that kind of proposal." That's when she looked at him properly. And that's when everything began to shift. "I need someone," he said. "For a week. To pretend to be my girlfriend. Public appearances. A gala. Some meetings. Nothing more." She stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but he just sat there, calm and serious. "I'll pay you $10,000, he added. "Half up front. The rest when the week is over." Madeline blinked. "Why me?" He tilted his head, as if studying her face. "Because you're believable. You're real. And I need people to believe I'm capable of something real." She let out a laugh, soft, surprised. "You're insane." "Probably," he agreed. "But I'm offering you a way out. Even if just for a little while." She should have walked away. She should have said no and called him a lunatic. But instead, something in her paused. Something tired, something aching, something curious. $10,000 could cover 6 months of rent. It could buy her time to breathe. "What's the catch?" she asked. "No physical expectations. No emotional strings," he said. "Just appearances. 7 days." She stared at him again, trying to make sense of the man in front of her. He was the kind of person who had always lived in a world far above hers. But he wasn't smiling like he was toying with her. He looked, somehow, just as tired as she was. Madeline crossed her arms. "You've got yourself a deal. But if you're lying." "I won't lie," he said. Not to you. And just like that, her life began to change. Madeline had never been in a car that smooth before. The black town car rolled through the city like it floated above the ground, so quiet inside it almost felt like the outside world had been put on mute. She sat stiffly in the back seat, staring out the tinted window, her hands clutched around the strap of her worn-out purse. Everything felt surreal. Just 2 days ago, she was mopping floors at the diner and counting quarters to buy a gallon of milk. Now she was on her way to a 5-star hotel to meet with a man who had handed her a check for $5,000 like it was spare change. She hadn't told anyone about the arrangement. There was no one to tell. No close friends. No family nearby. Even if she had someone, how could she explain it? A stranger walks into her life, offers her a week of pretending, and she says yes because her back is against the wall. It sounded pathetic when she thought about it too hard, so she didn't. She just kept repeating to herself that it was only 7 days. When the car stopped, a uniformed doorman opened her door, addressing her as Miss James. She felt ridiculous. Her jeans were clean but old, and her sneakers were scuffed at the toes. Still, she walked through the lobby with her chin up, like she belonged, even though the chandelier above her probably cost more than everything she owned. Alexander was already waiting for her. He stood near the elevator in a dark charcoal suit that looked like it had been sewn directly onto him. Not a wrinkle in sight. His hair was swept back, his watch gleamed, and his posture was impossibly perfect. For a moment, Madeline hesitated, wondering again what in the world he saw in her that made her the right person for this bizarre plan. "You're early," he said, not unkindly. "So are you," she replied. He didn't smile, but she noticed a slight lift at the corner of his mouth. "Come upstairs. We have a lot to go over." She followed him into the elevator, standing in silence as they ascended to the penthouse suite. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that could have been mistaken for a luxury apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows, soft lighting, sleek furniture. She had never even imagined rooms like this, let alone been inside one. Alexander gestured to the sofa. "Sit. We're going to do a crash course in who you are." She blinked. "Excuse me? For the next week, you're not Madeline James, waitress. You're Madeline James, my girlfriend. I've created a backstory, how we met, where we traveled, what your interests are. You'll need to memorize it. There will be questions. And cameras." Madeline raised an eyebrow. "So I'm an actress now?" "Consider yourself in the role of a lifetime," he said, handing her a folder thick with notes. She opened it and skimmed the pages. Fake bios, stories, even shared jokes. He'd scripted their relationship like a screenplay. "You've really thought this through," she said. "I have a lot at stake," he replied. "This deal I'm working on, it's more than just business. They need to believe I'm capable of connection. Commitment. Humanity. And you're not?" He looked at her, his eyes colder than they had been moments before. "Not the way they expect." She nodded slowly, reading between the lines. This wasn't just about business. He didn't trust people. Maybe never had. But instead of avoiding the game, he was controlling it. Building his image piece by piece, and she was one of them now. They spent hours going through the details. She asked questions, sometimes rolled her eyes, sometimes laughed at how absurd it all was. But he didn't seem to mind her sarcasm. In fact, the more honest she was, the more he watched her with a kind of quiet curiosity, like she puzzled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. By the end of the evening, she was exhausted. "You'll stay here tonight," he said suddenly. "What?" "The first event is tomorrow morning. Early. It'll be easier if you're already here. You have your own room. No obligations." She hesitated, then nodded. This wasn't about trust. It was about logistics. And besides, something in his tone made her believe that he wasn't lying. Not this time. That night, as she lay on the softest bed she'd ever touched, staring up at a ceiling higher than any apartment she'd ever lived in, Madeline realized something strange. She wasn't scared. Not of him. Not of the plan. Not even of the lie she was about to live. What scared her, deep down, was how badly she wanted to belong in this world, if only for a little while. The first event was nothing like Madeline had expected. She had imagined a flashy party with photographers shouting names and champagne overflowing in crystal flutes, but what she walked into was far more intimidating, controlled, quiet, and full of people who could spot a lie from across the room. It was a brunch meeting held in the penthouse of a luxury high-rise, hosted by the international investors Alexander was courting for a major deal. Every guest was powerful, polished, and accustomed to reading people with unsettling accuracy. She could feel their eyes on her the moment she stepped in beside him, their polite smiles sharp and curious. Alexander didn't touch her hand, but he stood close, his presence steady and commanding. He introduced her with calm precision, referring to her as Maddie, a detail she remembered from the file he'd handed her, his carefully curated version of their fictional relationship. In this story, she was a graphic designer, they had met at a charity event, and bonded over a shared passion for urban revitalization. Madeline wasn't sure which part of that was more ridiculous, but she kept her face still and her voice steady as she shook hands, answered questions, and smiled when expected. At first, it felt like she was walking a tightrope, one wrong phrase and she'd fall. But something strange began to happen. As she answered questions and improvised small details, she felt the room shifting. People began to believe her, not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't. She wasn't overly polished or rehearsed. She was calm, kind, and unpretentious in a room full of people used to performance. She spoke plainly, laughed when it felt natural, and made a quiet effort to listen instead of dominate. She wasn't dazzling, but she was believable. Alexander watched it all with a kind of silent awe. He hadn't expected her to blend in so seamlessly. At one point, one of the older investors leaned over to him and said, "She's very refreshing. Not like the others." Alexander only nodded, but something in his expression tightened. After the brunch, when they were finally back in the car, Madeline sank into the seat and let out a long breath. "Did I embarrass you?" she asked. "No," he said quickly, surprising even himself. "You were better than I could have hoped." She turned her head to look at him. "You mean I didn't ruin your reputation?" He glanced at her. "I mean, I forgot it wasn't real." She blinked, unsure how to respond. The words weren't romantic, not even warm, but they hit differently. Coming from him, they felt like an admission. The rest of the day was a blur of fittings, rehearsals, and a press dinner scheduled for that evening. Madeline's new wardrobe had been carefully chosen to maintain the illusion: clean lines, understated elegance, nothing flashy or bold. Alexander had clearly decided her image needed to match the narrative he had crafted, the grounded, real woman who reminded him of what mattered. It was all so carefully thought out that it made her stomach turn a little. She was a product in his design. And yet, the way he looked at her that morning in the car didn't feel calculated. At the dinner, things grew more complicated. They sat at a long table surrounded by more faces Madeline didn't recognize but had memorized from the prep materials. Investors, socialites, executives. Wine flowed, stories were exchanged, and more than once, she caught people watching her and whispering. She tried to ignore it until one of the women leaned across the table with a tight smile and asked, "So, how does a girl like you land a man like Alexander?" Madeline hesitated just for a second too long. It was a trap, and she knew it. If she laughed it off, they'd think she was fake. If she sounded too proud, they'd think she was lying. "He made me laugh," she said simply. And then he kept showing up. There was a pause, then a ripple of light laughter. The tension broke. The woman leaned back, somewhat surprised. Later that night, back in the penthouse, Alexander poured 2 glasses of wine and handed her one. He looked tired, not physically, but like the day had worn him down in a way she couldn't quite see. "You handled that question well," he said. "I almost choked," she admitted. He shook his head. "No. You were honest. Or at least it felt that way." She sipped her wine and looked at him over the rim of the glass. "Why did you really choose me?" He didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, stared out at the city for a long moment. "Because you didn't look impressed," he said finally. "When I made the offer. When you saw me." She thought about that. "You don't like being admired?" "I don't trust it." She understood that more than she wanted to. For the first time, she realized they might have more in common than she'd thought. That night, as she lay in the guest room bed, Madeline stared at the ceiling, playing the events of the day over in her head. It had only been 24 hours, and already the lines between performance and reality were beginning to blur. She wasn't just pretending anymore. She was learning who he was beneath the perfect suit and the steel-cold stare. And what she saw, slowly emerging behind the carefully constructed image, both intrigued and terrified her. Because underneath it all, Alexander Rains was human. And she had no idea what to do with that. By the 4th day, Madeline started to notice a change in the way Alexander looked at her. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was there in the little things, the way he turned his head slightly when she spoke, the way his gaze lingered a bit longer than necessary, and how he seemed to pause before answering her, like he was thinking more carefully than usual. She had spent enough time around guarded people to know when someone was letting their armor slip. What surprised her wasn't that Alexander was changing. What surprised her was how much she cared. They had attended a string of events together by then, and each one felt easier than the last. Their banter came more naturally, their rhythm smoother. She could read his cues without thinking, and he trusted her to handle herself without needing to coach or correct her anymore. In public, they looked like a couple perfectly in sync. In private, things were more complicated. One evening, after a particularly exhausting panel discussion and another round of being paraded through introductions, Alexander suggested they skip the planned dinner and go somewhere less formal. Madeline, startled by the spontaneity, simply nodded. He drove them himself, without the usual driver or security detail, and they ended up at a quiet, hole-in-the-wall Italian place tucked between 2 warehouses. It wasn't trendy or expensive. It was just normal. The waitstaff didn't recognize him, and no one paid them special attention. They sat at a small table near the back, with warm bread, wine poured from a bottle with no label, and candlelight that flickered slightly between them. It felt like another world, one without expectations or scripts. Madeline watched him as he relaxed into the moment. He laughed more easily here, without the constant weight of appearances. At one point, she made a sarcastic comment about how terrible his handwriting was, referencing something she'd seen in his notes, and he didn't snap back or defend himself. He just grinned and admitted, "That's why I type everything." It was the first time she'd seen him truly laugh, shoulders shaking, eyes crinkling at the edges, and something about it caught her off guard. She wasn't supposed to be enjoying this. She wasn't supposed to feel safe. They talked more that night than they had the entire week. Not about business or appearances, but about books they'd read, movies they hated, places they wished they could visit if time and money weren't factors. She told him about her childhood in Nebraska, about her mother's illness, about the way she learned to depend on no one but herself. He listened, not with polite detachment, but with quiet intensity, like her words mattered. And then, as they walked back to the car under the streetlights, the night cooled and quiet, he asked her something that broke the rhythm. "If we weren't pretending, would you still sit across from me like that?" She didn't answer right away. Her heart beat faster than it should have, and she tried to look anywhere but at him. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe I wouldn't have had the chance." That's not what I asked, he replied. She turned to face him fully then, standing still on the sidewalk. Then yes. I would. He didn't say anything else. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, like he was filing that answer somewhere deep inside. That night, as they returned to the penthouse, the air between them felt heavier, but not in a bad way. It was full of something unnamed, something that had been waiting quietly to be acknowledged. Madeline went to her room without another word, but she stood at the door for a long time before closing it. She didn't know what was happening between them, or what it meant, but something was changing. And it wasn't just him. She was changing too. And the scariest part was that for the first time in years, she didn't want to run. By the fifth day, the boundaries between fiction and reality were no longer just blurry, they were dissolving. What had started as a transaction was now becoming something deeper, something messier, something Madeline wasn't sure either of them fully understood. She still remembered the terms of the agreement, still heard the words, no emotional strings, echoing in the back of her mind. But they felt hollow now, almost like a warning neither of them had really believed in from the beginning. That morning, Alexander had a boardroom appearance scheduled, a small media presentation that Madeline didn't need to attend. He offered her the day off, but instead of leaving, she stayed in the penthouse, unsure why. She told herself it was because she had nowhere else to be, but the truth was simpler and more dangerous. She didn't want to be far from him. While he was gone, she wandered through the quiet space, noticing how little of him there actually existed in it. The decor was cold and minimal, the walls devoid of personal photos, and everything too neat, too impersonal. It looked like a place you passed through, not one where you lived. On the desk in his office, she found a drawer full of neatly filed contracts, notebooks with pages of tidy handwriting, and one old photo tucked into a leather folder, Alexander as a child, maybe 10, standing beside a tired-looking woman with the same eyes. His mother. There was no frame, no display. Just a memory kept hidden. She closed the drawer carefully, feeling like she had peeked at something sacred. And for the first time, she realized how lonely his life must be. When Alexander returned that afternoon, something in his expression was off. He didn't say much. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and sat in silence. Madeline watched him for a moment before speaking. Tough day? He gave a tight nod but didn't elaborate. You look like you haven't taken a real breath since you walked in. He let out a quiet exhale, then looked at her. They're pushing me to expand. Faster than I want to. Faster than I'm ready for. And what do you want? He hesitated. To stop pretending. Just for one day. Madeline sat down across from him, folding her hands. Then don't pretend with me. There was a pause, then a shift in his posture. He looked at her differently, not like she was part of the plan, but like she was a part of his life. Not because she was supposed to be, but because he wanted her to be. I used to think if I controlled everything, I couldn't get hurt, he said quietly. Every detail. Every dollar. Every relationship. Keep it tight, keep it clean. And now? Now I'm looking at you, sitting here like you belong, and I feel like I'm losing control for the first time in a decade. Madeline's chest tightened. There were so many things she could have said, reassurances, jokes, reminders that this was all fake. But none of them felt right. So instead, she said the one thing that scared her most. I'm scared too. He looked at her for a long moment. Of what? Of how much I want this to be real. The silence that followed was full of electricity. And then, slowly, Alexander stood and walked to her. He didn't touch her, didn't reach for her like a man trying to claim something. He just stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. I don't know what to do with any of this, he admitted. I don't know how to stop performing. Then let's figure it out together, she whispered. The rest of the day passed quietly, without pretenses. No events. No cameras. No rehearsed lines. They sat on the couch, side by side, watching an old movie neither of them really paid attention to. At one point, she leaned her head on his shoulder, and he didn't move. He just stayed there, solid and still, as though he was afraid even shifting might break whatever fragile piece they had found. By the time the credits rolled, Madeline knew with painful clarity that she wasn't pretending anymore. And she wasn't sure Alexander was either. But the fear of what came next was rising fast, like a tide she couldn't stop. Because every story she had ever been a part of, every moment that had felt this good, had always come with an ending. And this one was only supposed to last 2 more days. By the 6th day, Madeline had completely forgotten how to separate truth from fiction. What had once been a week-long act crafted around careful appearances now felt like the most honest connection she had ever experienced. The man she had agreed to pretend with was no longer a stranger in a sharp suit, he was something else entirely. And that terrified her more than she expected. The morning began slowly. They had nothing scheduled until evening, just a gallery event that would be filled with well-dressed art investors and the kinds of people who measured success by how many countries their wine had been imported from. Alexander offered to let her sleep in, but she found herself wide awake early, walking barefoot through the penthouse kitchen, making coffee like it was her home. When he walked in, still in his pajama shirt, hair slightly mussed, he looked more human than she had ever seen him. "You made coffee?" he asked, clearly surprised. "I figured the least I could do was start the day off like a decent fake girlfriend," she said, smiling. He poured himself a mug and leaned against the counter. "You're a lot better at this than I thought you'd be." "At making coffee or pretending to love you?" He laughed, but it wasn't empty. It was soft, almost uncertain. "Both, actually." They stood there for a moment, the steam rising between them, and for the first time, neither one of them felt like they had to say anything clever or keep the distance safe. Something had changed, and they both felt it. Later that afternoon, while Alexander was on a call in the other room, Madeline found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the skyline and wondering how it had come to this. It was supposed to be easy. 7 days, a paycheck, and a return to her real life. But now the thought of walking away made her stomach twist. Not because of the luxury or the comfort, those things still felt foreign, but because of him. She didn't want to unknow him. And she was starting to believe he felt the same. But her hope was shattered that evening. The gallery was stunning, glass walls, modern sculpture, subtle classical music. Alexander arrived in a sleek black suit, Madeline in a pale blue dress he had chosen for her. The moment they walked in, they became the couple everyone noticed. They were elegance without effort, mystery wrapped in charm. People whispered, watched, approached. And for the first hour, everything was perfect. Until Madeline overheard a conversation that stopped her heart. She had stepped into the hallway to breathe for a moment when she heard 2 men talking, one of them a senior partner in the investment firm Alexander had been pursuing all week. "So is it true," one asked, "that he hired her to play the role? Heard she's not even from his world." The other man chuckled. "It's classic Rains. Control the optics. Make it look like he's grounded. They're eating it up." Madeline stood frozen. Her palms went cold, her face flushed. She walked back into the gallery, heart pounding, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Alexander, deep in conversation, unaware. She waited until they were alone in the car. "You told them?" she asked quietly. "Told who what?" he said, confused. "That I was a performance. A perfectly cast part in your image." His confusion faltered. His silence was the only answer she needed. "It got out," he said, slowly. "But I didn't tell them directly." Madeline's voice broke. "So I'm a tactic now? Something you designed to win a deal?" "No," he said quickly, his eyes locking on hers. "It didn't start that way. But it's not that anymore. You know that. Do I? She said. Because right now, I feel like a pawn in your very expensive chess game. I never meant for this to happen. But it did, she said. And now I don't know what's real. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The ride back to the penthouse was silent. She walked straight to her room, locked the door, and sat on the bed staring at the contract she had folded into her purse on the first night. It was just paper. Just 7 days. Just an agreement. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped playing a part. And now, it felt like she had been the only one who had. Madeline didn't sleep that night. She lay on top of the covers in her dress, still half-zipped in the back, staring at the ceiling of a room that never truly felt like hers. Her mind replayed the conversation she'd overheard at the gallery and every word Alexander had said in the car. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the version of him that had laughed in the kitchen that morning and told her he didn't know how to stop performing. But the doubt was louder now. And heartbreak, she had learned, was always clearest in silence. By the time the sun rose, she had already packed her things. She didn't take much, just what she had brought, plus the blue dress she couldn't bring herself to leave behind. She folded the contract in half and placed it on the kitchen counter, along with the envelope containing the second half of the payment. She had never cashed the first check. It didn't matter now. Some parts of her life weren't for sale. She didn't leave a note. She stepped into the elevator with a suitcase that squeaked and a heart that ached, not just from what had happened, but from how much she had let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. She had played her role too well. And in doing so, she had forgotten that real life never came with a script. Downstairs, the car wasn't waiting. There were no goodbyes. No dramatic chase. Just the city, already alive, people moving, horns blaring, and no one noticing the girl walking out of the building with tears in her eyes and her whole chest caving in. She went back to her old apartment on the other side of town, a fifth-floor walk-up with creaky stairs and thin walls that let in every sound. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She threw her bag in the corner, pulled the curtains closed, and let herself cry until her body gave out. She didn't answer messages, didn't check social media, didn't reach out to anyone. For the first time in a long time, she let herself be invisible again. Across the city, Alexander stood in front of the kitchen counter, staring at the envelope she had left behind. He had come home late after a long, sleepless night of meetings and damage control, only to find silence and absence waiting for him. The penthouse felt wrong without her presence, too large, too quiet, too controlled. He picked up the contract, ran his fingers over the crease in the paper, and realized something that stopped him cold. She had never truly belonged in his world. And yet, she had made it feel like a world he wanted to live in. He didn't go to the office that day. For the first time in years, he canceled every meeting. He spent hours walking through the city, no destination in mind, just the need to move. He ended up outside a small bookstore where they had passed by once, in the early days of the week, when she pointed at the window and said she used to imagine herself owning a place like that. He had barely listened at the time. Now, it was all he could think about. The next morning, he found the shelter where she had once volunteered briefly during college. It was a part of her she had only mentioned once, in passing, like she didn't think it was worth talking about. But he remembered. He donated enough to fund the entire year of operations, anonymously, with one condition, that they name a new reading room after her. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he needed to do something that wasn't about image or strategy. Something real. Days passed. Madeline started working again, nights at the diner, mornings cleaning apartments. The money could have helped, but she couldn't bring herself to touch it. She kept it in a box under her bed, unopened, like it belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed. She missed him. That was the hardest part. Not the luxury. Not the attention. Him. His presence. His silence when she needed it, and his words when she didn't expect them. But she told herself she had made the right choice. Then, one evening, just as the diner was about to close, he walked in. He didn't wear a suit. No driver, no phone in hand. Just him, in jeans and a sweater, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him, but more real too. He walked to the counter, slowly, as if afraid she'd vanish if he moved too fast. "I'm not here to fix it," he said. "I just want to talk." She said nothing, but she didn't stop him either. He took a breath. "You were right. About everything. I treated you like a solution. Like something I could use to soften the world I built. But you weren't part of the image. You were the only real thing I had in it." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw the man behind the empire. Not the one who had chosen her to play a part, but the one who had slowly learned how to stop pretending. "I don't need a contract," he said. "I don't need a week. I just want whatever you're willing to give me. Even if it's just a minute." And for the first time in days, Madeline felt the weight in her chest begin to shift. Because he had come back. Not with money. Not with promises. But with the truth. The gallery looked different this time. It wasn't filled with strangers in expensive suits or clinking glasses or hushed conversations about market shares and global expansions. Tonight, it was warm, alive with laughter and soft music, and most importantly, it was filled with people who actually knew each other's names. The exhibit was a fundraiser for the reading program at a local shelter, the one Madeline had once volunteered at during college and that Alexander had quietly supported in the weeks after she walked out of his life. The gallery had offered to host the event for free once they learned of the size of the anonymous donation, and Madeline had agreed to help organize it, on one condition: her name wasn't anywhere near the promotional materials. She didn't want credit. She just wanted to be useful. She stood near the back wall, dressed simply in a navy dress and low heels, her hair curled gently around her shoulders. She looked beautiful in the way that comes from peace, not effort. There was still a hint of nerves in her posture, though. Tonight wasn't just about books or children or charity. Tonight was the first time she had seen Alexander Rains in person since he had walked into that diner 2 weeks ago and asked for a single minute of her time. They had spoken a few times since then. Slowly, carefully. No pressure. No promises. Just conversations, real ones. They didn't talk about the past too much. They didn't try to name what was happening. But each exchange had pulled them closer to something neither of them had expected, a beginning that wasn't based on performance, contracts, or roles. Just two people trying to meet in the middle, without pretense. When Alexander entered the gallery that night, he didn't seek the spotlight. He walked through the doors like anyone else, nodding politely to the volunteers and scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. She saw him the moment he arrived, and for a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then she smiled, and it wasn't hesitant. It was quiet, and strong, and full of something like understanding. He made his way over slowly, wearing a black shirt and no tie, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked relaxed in a way she hadn't seen since their week together had begun. When he stopped in front of her, he didn't try to say anything clever. He didn't reach for her hand or lean in. He just looked at her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. "You came," she said softly. "Of course I did," he replied. "This place exists because of you." She shook her head. "It exists because of a donation." "No," he said. "It exists because of who you are. I just finally started paying attention." They stood in silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of everything they had left unsaid, everything they had both learned to be afraid of, and everything they were slowly trying to trust again. Later, as the night came to a close and the last of the guests filtered out, Alexander stayed behind to help clean up. He moved chairs, carried boxes, and took orders from volunteers without flinching. Madeline watched him with quiet amazement. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply present. When the room was nearly empty, he walked over to her again, holding a folded piece of paper. "I wasn't sure if I should give you this," he said. "But I wrote it after the day you left." She took the paper without opening it and looked up at him. "Why didn't you send it?" "Because back then, I was still trying to fix things with gestures. Now, I'd rather just be here. If you want me." Her voice was low, but steady. "And if I say yes, what happens next?" "I stop pretending," he said. "For good." Madeline didn't say anything. She reached for his hand and laced her fingers through his. They didn't kiss. They didn't make grand declarations. They simply stood there, together, holding on. Weeks turned into months. They didn't rush into anything, didn't try to define it too fast. Alexander started working fewer hours, focusing on more meaningful projects. Madeline took a job running the literacy program at the shelter, finding joy in work that finally felt like purpose. Sometimes they still argued. Sometimes they misunderstood each other. But they always returned to the place they had found in that gallery, that place of quiet, simple truth. No scripts. No roles. Just love that had been earned the hard way. And on an ordinary morning, with coffee brewing in the kitchen and sunlight pouring through the windows of a much smaller apartment they had chosen together, Alexander looked across the table at her, the woman who had changed everything, and said quietly, "This is the only deal I ever want to keep." She smiled, no performance in sight, and answered, "Then don't break it." They never did. This story is, at its core, about two people who weren't looking for love, who didn't even believe they deserved it, but found something far more powerful, the courage to be seen. What makes the ending meaningful isn't that Madeline and Alexander ended up together, but how they did. Not through a whirlwind romance or a perfect plan, but through discomfort, honesty, and slow, earned trust. Madeline's strength was never in becoming someone else, it was in refusing to lose herself, even when handed a life she thought she wanted. And Alexander's transformation wasn't about redemption through love, it was about finally stepping away from control and learning how to live without a script. Their relationship didn't begin in a fairy tale, it began in a contract, but what they built was something real, something imperfect, and something truly human. The beauty of this ending is that it doesn't promise a perfect life. It promises a true one. And that, in the world they came from, is the rarest kind of love.